Okay, so we are on air. Oleksandra, would you start?
Hello again, Edwin, colleagues. Nice to see you to talk on the issue of extraordinary importance. Maybe it's not the first time ever we debate information, misinformation, disinformation, and the propaganda. It's not the first time, but the importance of this issue is continue to grow, and that is why we put extraordinary attention to the reaction of the world toward the challenge we've faced. And I'm really glad that today we are together with Batory Foundation and with other partners to discuss this again. I'm an executive director of the International Renaissance Foundation Ukraine, and it's a big pleasure to me to welcome everybody to join this event, to speak, to participate, and I'm eager to listen to you and our Ukrainian audience partners. I would like to welcome Ukrainian Prism as a major partner of this, co-organizer of this event. And this is our long-term reliable partner in many international projects. And with this discussion, we continue to demonstrate our deep acknowledgement of the importance of the issue. I think that today I am really glad to see the list of the speakers. So I was really very pleasantly surprised when I saw the key experts on the field agreed to take part in this event, which makes it really international, not just bilateral Ukrainian-Polish, but really international. And so that with these words, I'm just ready. I'm just saying my warm welcome to everybody and hoping to have a good, productive discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Oleksandra. And dear guests, let me welcome you on behalf of the Stefan Batory Foundation. But before I begin to moderate this conference, let me express my gratitude to Oleksandr Sushko and his organization, International Renaissance Fund, and to Prism organization for cooperation. It was really a great privilege to work together. And generally, the possibility to work with Oleksandr and his International Renaissance Fund is for us very important part of activity. But this time, we are going beyond the scope of Polish-Ukrainian relations. We are going to talk about disinformation, the topic which is important and relevant for every country and society now. So we expect a lot from this conversation, from this meeting. And as I said, no country and no society are free of the danger of disinformation. And we could see that even challenges like the pandemic are used as an opportunity to interfere in the public debate and communications. But there are many other opportunities. Everybody knows about the role of foreign agents and cyber troops in the United Kingdom Brexit referendum or in the US presidential elections of 2016. It's just to refer to the most prominent examples. There are many more, and they show that contemporary media sphere is a complex system of communications based on information and disinformation, engaging many different actors: official media, cyber troops, hackers, secret services, politicians and political parties, agencies of the state, academia, or civic organizations. Our task for today is to find a way through this complexity, to better understand what is going on, who are the most important actors, What are the real dangers and challenges? What can we do to exert control over this sphere? What is the role of the state and its agencies? What can we do, activists of the civil society and people of media? As I said, no country and society are free from disinformation, but some are more exposed to it. Ukraine has been fighting with foreign aggression since 2014. Warfare is going on in real places with real losses of human lives on an everyday basis. But cyber warfare is an integral part of the game, and Ukraine had to develop unique competences to deal with this threat. I am sure we can use this knowledge and confront it with our experiences coming from different levels of reality, like specific countries or the level of European Union. The agenda for today is quite simple. We begin with introductions to the topic given by 4 eminent speakers. They will sketch the map of the problem and conclude with some arguments or remarks we can raise during the further conversation. We extend to other also eminent panelists. In the final round of our debate, we come back to the authors of introductory speeches to sum up the session. So this is the plan for today. We begin with, as I said, 4 interventions, 7 minutes each. As I said, Mr. Pomerantsev has to leave us earlier on, so you can use a little bit more time if you want in the first round, because you won't have an opportunity later on. And also because I expect you will give us a broader picture of it, so I would like to ask you to begin the interventions and to take floor as the first person. And let me shortly introduce Mr. Pomerantsev. Mr. Peter Pomerantsev is an author of very well-known books on disinformation and propaganda. He works for Institute of International Relations at the London School of Economics, where he is involved in the ARENA research program dedicated to overcoming the challenges of disinformation. I hope that I was correct in your presentation. If I missed something, please add, but the cyber floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to briefly lay out what I see as the structural issues at play, the structural approaches to dealing with it, and then a little bit about what we do at ARENA, which is one part of the puzzle, but it's very hands-on work, and it might serve as an interesting discussion point. So look, what I think we're experiencing isn't just, disinformation or fake news or information operations. We're talking about something much, much bigger. We're talking about, if you'll excuse the small in-joke, the structural disintegration of the public sphere. We had an idea in the 20th century what was the democratic information environment. And they were very simple principles: freedom of expression, pluralism, the metaphor of a marketplace of ideas. And that was the difference between a democratic information environment and a dictatorial one, which had censorship, one-state media, and no public sphere, no place for real debate. That's all been turned upside down, largely in the digital age. We now see a lot of these democratic ideals being turned on their heads. We see authoritarian and just authoritarian aspiring political groups not using censorship to control the information space, but overloading it with so much disinformation, confusion, trolls and bots and inauthentic activity that they can crush dissent. But this doesn't go against the laws or the ideals of freedom of expression. Well, when I talk to critics of regimes in the Philippines or in Mexico or even in Russia who are under attack by government troll armies, they tell me that it's very hard for them to formulate a strong argument because There's nothing illegal in creating more information. It's still within the spirit of the law of freedom of expression. Pluralism we see tip over into hyper-partisanship that is so wide that democratic debate breaks down. When we talk about foreign interventions, they're often aimed at these wedge issues, at furthering this polarization. And within all this, of course, the metaphor of a marketplace of ideas seems old-fashioned and quaint. So we're talking about a structural disintegration, really. And along with that, if we're talking about foreign intervention, which I know we will be today, you know, the Cold War was all about opening the borders, you know, about having information flow across the borders. And now we see how those same democratic ideals that we fought for in the Cold War, many people here literally fought for them in the Cold War and went to great risks to fight for them. We now see the dangers that come with them as well. So in order to sort of deal with this issue, it's not enough to simply expose the odd disinformation campaign or catch a bit of fake news, even though that is absolutely critical trench work. We do have to look at this larger picture and think about how we deal with it. I think there's many layers, and I suppose we'll be talking about that today. There is a regulatory layer, and I am encouraged by the new European Union Democracy Action Plan and Digital Service Act, which for the first time talks about the problem of disinformation as an issue, being very careful to say it's not about pieces of content, it's about inauthentic, coordinated behavior, it's about mass campaigns. I actually interviewed Vera Jourova about this, the Vice President of the EU, and she seemed to be sort of pushing it a bit forward. She's like, we still have to define this disinformation, but at least we are now in a movement of trying to think about it and define it, and also kind of divide it from the right to talk nonsense, which is a democratic right. So there is a regulatory part, and I hope we talk about that today. But us at Arena, we're thinking about something else. We're thinking about the response of public service spirited media in this age. And we're doing this at a point where the idea of public service media is really being transformed as we have to reimagine the public. Back in the days of broadcast media, we had a very vague idea of a public out there. What disinformation campaigns have made us understand is that we're competing with people, whether Russian or PR people, who are doing very, very specific audience analysis, targeting them very, very specifically. So we start from that question. How can we think about the public and engage with them in democratic ways? Think about them with the same level of detail and understanding that the other side do, but then think about how you talk to them in democratic ways. And there's a range of things that you can consider doing. In America, there's lots of experimentation with bringing the public into the newsroom to get them more engaged. Yeah, if the propagandists play on lack of trust and division, how do you bring the audience in to make that trust stronger? We've been working in several countries in Europe and Ukraine, which I consider Europe, obviously, doing lots and lots of sociology, doing lots and lots of focus groups, lots and lots of audience analysis, and then trying out how you can frame content and how you can deliver content in a way that heightens trust, especially among what is now called vulnerable audiences, though I don't like this term very much. But I do think essentially we are in a race with the peddlers of disinformation, the masters of influence operations. We're in a race to see who understands audiences better. I always compare it to the race between a cult leader and a psychotherapist. A cult leader also understands people, understands their traumas, their vulnerabilities, you know, their lack of trust and their alienation to society, and then exploits that. That is what Russian propaganda does. That's what all propaganda does. It works in that gap. What our job is as people who have a belief in public service media is to also understand these traumas, also understand these issues, but then bring them into public speech, help people talk about them, discuss them, confront them, but bring them out. I think I managed it in 7 minutes. Good.
Okay, thanks a lot. Just one specific question. You mentioned about the role of public service media, but do we have still them? So because, you know, in countries like Poland or many other countries, public service media are the problem, but not the part of the solution for the problem. So what's going on in other countries? What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I realize Poland still has a public service media in name, but it's not. It is now an old-fashioned state-controlled media, I think. I was definitely looking that way from the outside. I'll leave it to the polls to see whether I'm exaggerating, but it certainly seems that way when we look at it from outside. No, let's call it public service spirited. Yeah, you're quite right. A lot of public service media has been either captured, as we see in lots of countries, or is just not very good. Let's talk about public service spirited. Other people call it civic media. In America, I think it'll be more a civic media movement. I don't think there's a strong tradition of public service media. It's much more about the ideals that it has. And the ideals, even though the challenge is new, and even though our idea of the public is in a real transformative moment at the moment, how we think about the public, how we define the public, it's also a very old idea. Of course it is. It's a very old idea. If you go back, which I always like to do, to Lord Reith, the creator of the BBC, he talked about the mission of public service media to create a public discussion, to create a public sphere, to create a public discourse. Yeah, not simply to do what commercial media won't do, which is the narrow definition that we find in America. So public service media do science programs. No, it's much bigger. When I talk about public service spirited media, I mean media whose job is to bring in the whole of a society into a free, full, and fair debate. So it's actually the original meaning of it when it was used to create the BBC. So that's what I mean by that. That doesn't have to be, I don't think it will be in the future, a single big TV channel.
Okay.
It could be many, many, many small civic media that do this.
Thanks a lot for this explanation. So now it's time for the second speaker, and I'd like to invite Mr. Jerzy Pomianowski, an executive director of the European Endowment for Democracy. So Mr. Pomianowski, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Edwin, and thank you, Batory Foundation and Renaissance Foundation for organizing this event. Much we talk over the last few years on the issue, more we need to talk to really tackle it well. So any initiative, any effort is extremely welcome. Let me start with the very general, reflection about 21st century authoritarianism and dictatorships. We can say the good news is that they all understood that they need to have some kind of popular support, whether artificially generated or for some moments in the history genuine, but still they need it. So the nature of dictatorship has changed in a sense. And second reflection is less optimistic. By knowing that they need this type of support, there is also a kind of common already knowledge, we don't need to prove it, that if you can capture 30% of your society successfully with your propaganda messages, with your narratives, you are controlling the society. So if we capture 1 of 3 minds, we are good as a dictators. And if we then can discourage 40% of society from action, just by blurring their minds and confusing their minds, we have a 70% majority. And that is exactly combination of these 2 elements, propaganda and disinformation. Propaganda serves to capture actively people's mind, to push them for action, to support, like, you know, they are fascist, or Europe wants to kill us, Moscow says, and Dmitry Kisilov says. And then, of course, for those who have more, I would say, ability to really see what things are, let's blur their minds with some kind of toxic messages, or confusing them with many information and many type of different messages. So that's the nature. I think it is well known, but it's always good to underline these 2 elements in one that serve the certain purpose. With regard to disinformation specifically, and especially our ability to react, we have to, and I will make a quick 7 points. I hope I will manage with the 4 minutes. First, there is already quite understanding that it has to be done through the whole of society approach. In a sense, governments alone, civil society alone, media alone, tech companies alone, they cannot manage by themselves. There has to be a joint action. Second, there is, if we try to distinguish between different operators here, there is definitely lack of proper embedding of the issue of disinformation in the government structures and institution. And with few exceptions, it is an ongoing problem. They are scattered around. There is no one strong centers or institutions that effectively are responsible and try to build a longer term strategy. There is also lack of proportional allocation of funding and resources, especially by assessing threats and trying to build a certain strategy where response is proportional to the threat. Not to mention old-fashioned behaviors. Here, I would definitely point the Ukraine case, where I was extremely unhappy that instead of supporting so great civil society, the government of Ukraine decided to create Minister of Information as a response to disinformation. Maybe the Minister of Information does a good job, but much more effective. Yevhen is here. Stop Fake was doing much more and much faster than any ministry has done over the years that it created its structures, departments, bureaucratic procedures, and so on and so on. So in a sense, also innovativeness and ability to understand what tools are working well. And that is also part of the proportional response and proportional resource to be generated. Then finally, there is similar problem within international cooperation on disinformation. G7 has created rapid response mechanism established in 2018 to coordinate information sharing, but it doesn't work that well that we would expect. NATO also is still struggling to define its role in it. So for so many years, we are aware of the problem, but still there is a lack of good coordination. Finally, US-EU coordination, of course, within the Trump administration, it was not easy. Let's see how it's going to be now. But still, I see a huge gap here between two major operators with democracy support programs. There is a very, very little coordination or not enough coordination, and the back for more. Of consistency of approach within the private sector, especially social media. Until recently, there was zero willingness to take responsibility for its own action. This has changed slightly under public pressure, yet response is far from being comprehensive. And the closing of Trump account by Twitter, the last days of his presidency is really too little and too late. And finally, let me say that disinformation is just a very profitable business. And we cannot see it only through the kind of ideological or geopolitical logic. But there are financial incentives that drive disinformation actors such as e-commerce, e-payments, online political advertising, and the Global Disinformation Index cautiously estimated is more than around 250, 230 million US per year in ad revenue paid only to disinformation sites, with Google being the top provider of ad services to disinformation domains. In US alone, 1/3 of disinfo groups is using PayPal system. So I think it's also time to stop funding or to limit funding of disinformation by tackling these issues also at the policy level and regulatory level. I will stop here because my time is ending, but I am happy to join more on the local perspective because EED supports many very interesting innovative initiatives in the whole region, not only in Ukraine, but in all countries of the Eastern Partnership, but also we support media beyond region, Russian language media that are independent, that also play important role. But that's a separate issue, so I will stop here now.
Okay, thanks a lot for your intervention. We will have an opportunity to add other topics during further conversations. So thanks for the moment. And now let me invite to the discussion Ms. Alexandra Zakhanovska from Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group from Ukraine Crisis Media Center from Kiev. Oleksandra, please come up to the stage.
Thank you. It is a great pleasure and honor to be here. And honestly, it is quite difficult to take floor after such esteemed speakers. So I think I'm going to take it down a little bit and talk about one specific aspect of the hybrid influence that has an impact on all of us, on all the states that we here represent today. I mean, targeting bilateral and multilateral relations between partner states. Specifically, we know that Kremlin has been putting a lot of effort in undermining Ukrainian partnership with its neighbors, mostly with Hungary, of course, but also with Romania and definitely with Poland. And in my opinion, the goal of such activities is rather simple. Increased distance between partner states makes each of them more susceptible to malign foreign influence. And for Kiev, that means being left alone face to face with Moscow and the pressure coming from it to accept annexation of Crimea, to reintegrate occupied territories in the East on the Kremlin's terms, and to subsequently reject the European and Euro-Atlantic vector of foreign policy. The framework of such activities is mostly the same, regardless of which country, which bilateral relations we're talking about. And in my personal opinion, it has two levels. The first level is diplomatic, where tensions between states are heightened. And as we know, it may yield rather substantial results because, for example, the Hungarian-Ukrainian tensions are the brightest examples, as Budapest repeatedly blocks Ukraine-NATO council meetings. The second level, although these processes are parallel to be precise, is societal. And it is based, in my opinion, on the principles of reflexive control mostly, where aggressor manipulates the target into making a decision beneficial for the aggressor itself without even realizing it. Throughout manipulation, which mostly takes place in information field, the degree of distrust between target societies is heightened. To simplify, for example, the goal would be to promote mutual hostility between, let's say, Ukrainians and our Polish friends to such a level where it begins influencing policymaking. And here, historical and territorial revisionism play a very important role. In the specific case of Ukraine and Poland, there is a major element of portraying Poland as an aggressive state with imperialist ambitions towards Ukraine. And one favorite example that I like to give centers around Jakub Kareba, a frequent guest of propagandistic Russian TV shows who plays the role of an independent Polish expert. On a number of occasions, he had made claims about how Warsaw should have seized Ukrainian territories, which he claimed were traditionally Polish, starting with the Lviv region, of course. And these claims were then swiftly disseminated online, with their origin being easy to lose. So in the end, we found ourselves in a situation where many readers got an impression that this was a position of a rather respected Polish expert, which is shared by many in that country, while actually it is very far from the truth. In its turn, Ukraine, for the Polish audiences, is pictured as an unreliable partner, a state on the verge of collapse, a failed state. And COVID-19 pandemic was heavily used as a background for promotion of such narratives. In particular, Sputnik, the resource I think all of us know, unfortunately, very well, made claims about the imminent bankruptcy of Ukraine caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Some publications, quotes, claims made questioned even the possibility of Ukraine existing as a state after the pandemic. So what we see here is that disinformation works differently in regard to each target audience. The weaknesses and the vulnerabilities that are most easy to use and to exploit are chosen. And therefore the specific tactics may differ, but the strategy remains the same. I see that I still have 2 minutes to give one very illustrative, I think, example that involves representatives of 4 states at once. And it shows just how far the Kremlin sometimes is willing to go to undermine bilateral and multilateral relations. I'm talking about the case of arson of the Hungarian Cultural Center, which took place in Olgierd in Ukraine. It happened when relations between Ukraine and Hungary were have already been rather tense. And of course, it caused a new spike of tensions. After the investigation took place, however, 3 Polish citizens were arrested. And here we see how the conflict broadens, and it involves not just Ukraine and Hungary, but Poland as well. Further investigation, however, yielded even more interesting results, because it turned out that while Polish citizens performed the crime, they were not organizers. The organizer was a German citizen. His name was Manuel Oxenreiter, and he used to work in Bundestag for the deputy of a far-right Alternative for Deutschland political party. He was also involved with running a German language page in social media of a think tank named Kiev. And if we take a look at the board of this allegedly independent think tank, we can see that there are 3, if my memory serves me correctly, very interesting people on the board. First of all, it's Alexander Dugin. I think he's very well known here, a far-right Russian philosopher and one of the ideologists of Putin's regime. And also the board featured Sergei Glaziev, advisor to Putin, and Konstantin Malafeyev, a far-right media oligarch who was also involved in funding Russian hybrid aggression against Ukraine. So this is a very interesting case that shows how sophisticated the strategy is, and I need 30 more minutes to finish with 2 very small recommendations, because unfortunately I don't have time for more. My first recommendation would be to develop in each particular state an early detection system of disinformation and information psychological operations. And of course, for us as Ukraine and Poland, as Ukraine and Romania, as Ukraine and other Western partner states, it is very important to keep each other updated and to support mutual engagement. And if we talk about Poland specifically, because I dedicated a lot of attention, we need, in my opinion, involve heavily Poland into Crimean platform, because first and foremost, it would help us with the trust issues, and trust issues are heavily abused. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just one specific question. I mentioned in my introductory speech that you have unique competences in Ukraine concerning disinformation, because you have to deal with disinformation in a very special way. My question is, how do you feel? Can you see interest in these competences? Can you see interest, for example, in Poland or other countries to learn from your knowledge?
Yes, definitely. In Ukrainian expert community that is focused on countering disinformation, we see a lot of interest, but I think this interest should come from 3 sides at least. It should come from our international partners, and we see that a lot, and having discussions such as this is another manifestation that this topic is important, that we have a lot of lessons learned to exchange. This interest should also come from our own government, which in my personal opinion should involve our unique expertise, and it should do so more actively, although we know that there are hopes for launching the countering disinformation center in Ukraine. And depending on how exactly that center is structured, launched, and who is involved, maybe it will be a very good resilience building initiative. And finally, we need to see much more engagement and interest from our own home audience, because as NDI studies show, a lot of Ukrainians recognize that disinformation is a problem. However, when it comes directly to their ability to see it, to identify it, unfortunately, we still have a lot of work to do.
Thanks a lot. And now it's time for the fourth speaker, last but not least, Mr. Olgart Suchevsky from the Emerging Futures Institute in Poland, co-author of the report revealing Russian disinformation networks and active measures fueling secessionism and border revisions in Central and Eastern Europe. Mr. Syczewski, the floor is yours.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me. I want to be even more specific. So we started from the broader aspects, but now I want to see clearly and discuss with you how Russian Federation was exploiting and fueling conflicts between Poland and Ukraine specifically. So our study was based on a very deep internet monitoring, which was held. We were monitoring websites and Facebook posts from 1st January 2018 to April 15, 2020. We were looking for the peaks in numbers of content posted in each weeks, right? So based on that, we were able to determine in what periods of time the content posted by fringe and pro-Kremlin websites was highly more intense. When we established those peaks, there were at least 5 or 6 during that period, we were able to clear out the narratives and the events that fueled those information floods and information campaigns provided by the foreign actors or fringe media. But firstly, let's see what was the main topics that were used to fuel those conflicts and disputes. So firstly, of course, these were historical and ethnic conflicts between Poland and Ukraine, such as conflict over Lviv or Volhynia killing. But also, those actors were using current political events also to use in their favor, but this I will describe more in next minutes. But firstly, let's take a look what narratives were injected. So what type of messaging was injected into Polish society to create the tension? So first, the most popular one, we can phrase it as a Lviv has a Polish heritage and should belong to Poland. We know even that phrase in Polish Lvów, right? So this is a kind of a broad message that was exploited, and it was used in occasions of every hooligans act or types of not commemorating some historical events, or the messages were, for example, that Polish cemeteries are not being renovated. This all informations created the vision of Poland as a victim of history, that Polish heritage is being destroyed, right? And this brings us to second narrative, that Ukrainian society is anti-Polish, has anti-Polish attitudes. For example, those examples which are exploited was marches in favor of Bandera or in favor of Ukraine regaining independence. Of course, people there were using some kind of a historical symbols, but we could spot fake news of burning Polish flags, singing songs which are anti-Polish, etc. And of course, it was exploited that far-right movements on Ukraine are getting stronger and they are providing anti-Polish narratives. This example brings us to another very important narrative, that also Ukrainian government is becoming more and more anti-Polish because it's getting closer to far-right wing and far-right group of society inside the Ukraine. So basically the fringe media were claiming that Petro Poroshenko back then was getting closer to far-right groups to gain troops to fight with Russia, but of course it was also using examples of singing UPA songs, of being anti-Polish. So we can see a clear image of Ukraine state, which both on political and societal level is becoming strongly and strongly anti-Polish by using very historic symbolism, very emotional language, and sometimes fake examples, or even lies. And of course, the last very important narrative was, as Alexandra mentioned, Ukraine is a failed state. This was also a very important narrative. We could see a lot of examples of articles and website posts claiming that Poland and Russia should divide Ukraine in half because it would be economically good for Poland and for Russia, that Russia has no Ukraine, sorry, has no capability of existing independently, or for example, that even Ukraine is not a country or nationality, it's just a tendency. So we could spot even such informations and narratives in a Polish media space. But so how do such lies and such very fringe narratives, honestly, were spread out? So we could clearly see that there is an interconnected network of pro-Kremlin websites which are cross-posting their content through hyperlinks, through social media posts and forums. So that information, and you can see the network of those websites on our report, so I strongly recommend reading that. But all of that brings us to conclusion that we can see in each country coordinated dissemination campaign, right? Which is followed by noticeable number of fake personal accounts spreading content in closed far-right conspiracy Facebook groups, which are also very important in the fake news and disinformation dissemination. So thanks to the use of emotional language, using a strong sense of national identity and using commitment to traditional values, we can see that the target groups were consisting of far-right movements, parties, or paramilitary groups that in effect, they were willingly or unwillingly disseminate pro-Kremlin propaganda and disinformation. So this is very important. It's a network of coordinated actors who are acting in the same moment just to make the outreach bigger. So they're using algorithms just to spread the word. And this is a very important part, and like my final recommendation, that we could see that the role of closed Facebook groups is really crucial right now. They're out of control of moderators, and the things and messages and comments that are there, they can be really frightening if you do not know them and you are not expecting concrete narratives. This is a really game changer for now and something that should be done as soon as possible. And this is where I will end, and I expect your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have constructed quite good foundations for further discussion. Thanks for your presentations. Now it's time to open our debate to other panelists. But so I invite everybody to join the discussion. And I have also a message for broader audience who is watching us on monitors of computers to join us and to ask questions or comment on Facebook profiles. We will transmit your issues to our panelists, so do not hesitate and join us. And before I open the floor, so I have the question to Mr. Pomerantsev. Perhaps you would like to comment on some issues before you leave. If not, it's not obligatory, of course, but perhaps I'd like to give you a chance to comment if you would like.
I think that, look, firstly, it's fascinating hearing this research from, the details from Olgierd and Alexandra, and thank you so much. It's such important research to see the details, but already you see all the different elements in play, that we do need a structural approach for. The problem of coordinated, inauthentic behavior is one that we can regulate. I think troll farms, whether domestic or foreign, should be illegal, yeah? I think one person online being anonymous is fine. Yeah, I think we're allowed to be anonymous online. You can wear a mask to a party, that's fine. We cannot have a public sphere until we have one person, one voice, or else it's just not a real discussion. That can be regulated against. And I do think within the language of the Digital Service Act, if you look very carefully, they talk about inauthentic activity and its effects on civic discourse and how that can be regulated. Now, we need to define what a civic discourse, slight, which is not in the EU Digital Service Act, but that's a regulatory issue. We can do something about that and knock it on the head. But then there's the other part, going deep inside these historical traumas and issues, which themselves, when we do focus groups around historical issues, they're not even about history. History is actually a metaphor for how people feel now. You know, it won't even help you to sort of, well, it won't be enough to get the historical record straight. Often these historical discussions are sort of displaced ways of talking about how people feel in the present. And for that, you're going to have to compete with the other side. You're never going to stop all the propaganda. You're never, simply because we live in a world where that's impossible. And also a lot of it can be domestic. So there we're going to have to compete. So you both need regulation and competition.
Okay, thank you. And we have the first contributors. The first one is Miss Agnieszka Legucka from Polish Institute for Foreign Relations. So please take the stage. And now we have 5 minutes for every intervention.
Okay, thank you very much, Polish Institute of International Affairs. Thank you. I would like to ask...
International, okay, sorry. Mistake.
Not a problem. Thank you for very good and interesting inputs. I'm dealing with disinformation as well, but I'm struggling with the concept or understanding of disinformation. And I would ask you to help me with this because as Peter said, it's very broad and there is a broad understanding of disinformation today, and then sometimes we put everything in one box with the name of disinformation. So I would like you to maybe somehow bring us to the definition, or how do you define, all of you of course, define the disinformation, because from the Soviet time and the Soviet, of course, intelligence as active measures, we observed from that. In that sense, in the history, it was very centralized issue, yeah, by Kremlin, so coordinated very well. But today, Olgierd pointed very important message or important factor that Russian authorities actually adapted to the network of the disinformation activities, or like bots, like website, fake website, disinformation, propaganda. So at the same thing, could you a bit more or deeper elaborate, do you also consider the disinformation together with the cyber threats as well? Because sometimes it's missed understanding about what we are talking about exactly, and I would love to hear your opinion about it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and so we will raise the comments and questions, and we will answer to them in the final round. Okay, so we can do in this way. So now it's time for Mr. Volodymyr Yermolenko, Director of Analytics at Internews-Ukraine, Kiev.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and great pleasure to participate in this discussion. See several very familiar faces. Now, I would like to also follow up what Agnieszka said and kind of introduce some terminological issue, because it's very important. I think we sometimes frame the debate around the word disinformation, which is not really correct. There is a bunch of different concepts, and something which I would refer to is the concept of malinformation, which is a very important concept, which means that using information to harm. And that's the key thing, because if we only discuss disinformation, meaning using information to deceive or using false information to deceive somebody, I think we just see the peak of an iceberg. Because, for example, if we take these actors, for example, if we take a highly hot political issue in Ukraine, banning Medvedchuk-linked TV channels, well, of course, they were making a lot of disinformation, but the thing that they were very keen in is precisely malinformation. So they were using information, emotions, hate speech, etc., to harm Ukraine as a subject, to harm Ukraine's agency and empowerment. So if you ask me what is the key aim of malinformation, I would say that it is destruction of agency of somebody, of a person, of a country, of a nation. And in this strategy, it is sometimes using fake news, sometimes using lies, and sometimes using true information, something very, very important for citizens. If we are considering that our opponent is somebody who only lies, I think we are in a very weak situation, because we can't explain why people are following these resources, why they're watching them. It's like what Peter said about psychoanalysts, because they are using a real traumas. For example, if we take the Ukrainian example, these channels are using and abusing the economic troubles, the poverty in Ukraine, the increase of gas tariffs, etc. And the response, our response, of institutions, of donors, of civil society, should not only be like denouncing their lies. We should also engage into discussing these real problems. So let's not forget about these issues, how the malign actors are using the reality and facts to harm societies, people, etc. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot for this important intervention. And now it's time for Mr. Yevhen Fedchenko. Mr. Fedchenko is from Mohyla School of Journalism. He's also a co-founder of stopfake.org organization. So please,
thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to see familiar faces, and also it's great to hear your ideas, what else we can do, because Stop Fake was in this business of fighting disinformation for the last 7 years, and we always need to reinvent ourselves, because disinformation is very flexible, very dynamic, very adjustable, and it always goes into the new niches and into the new levels. And as soon as we are kind of responding to it, it always leaves us a little bit less space for creativity of a kind and how we can respond to that. So we really need to be more proactive probably at some point, but also what we need to do is probably being not only creative in our responses, because at some point we've had a lot of ideas that in order to tackle disinformation, we need to create more great quality content in different languages, and that would make disinformation disappearing. And now we see that probably it was a wrong approach, because high quality content and disinformation are working in very different leagues for very different audiences and operating very different approaches to those audiences. When we are talking about factual-based reporting, we are talking about facts. And when we are talking about Russian disinformation, you can go to any Russian TV channels and just look at how a bunch of people are yelling at each other. So definitely you would see a big difference in between those approaches, and they are dealing with very different instincts, if you want. The second point is preparing for this conference, I looked at the research made by Polish intelligence on how Russian disinformation is creating narratives on Poland, and what I saw is basically repeating Russians' narratives on Ukraine. So it's smearing Poland on international arena, undermining Poland's relations with neighboring countries, destabilizing NATO's activities, and stirring up between hostilities between Poland and other countries. That's exactly the playbook which is used against Ukraine. And so here we come to the idea that I was telling many, many times before, that you cannot tackle disinformation in one specific place and leaving it somewhere else, because we really need to talk about, finally, 7 years after beginning, about internationalization of this issue and working together. And we have a lot of great experience working with many people who we see at this conference. And we have a Polish Stop Fake, which is hugely dealing with historical issues. And I think it's our greatest contribution into helping our countries to understand better each other and to tackle historical disinformation. And also it gives us a lot of space for networking between organizations that are dealing with disinformation. And my final point is that if you again, if we would go back to some years before, you would remember that I was always saying that freedom cannot be indefinite. So basically we are coming again to Popper's paradox of tolerance, because if you would allow all those things to be around, you finally come to the end of tolerance. So, and this is a huge paradox. So at some point, for example, Ukraine came to the idea that, yes, we need to limit the influence of disinformation, including by banning Russian TV channels, for which we were severely criticized at that point, and Russian social media. And finally, those Ukrainian outlets that again were masquerading as a real media outlets here. And finally, we see the complete change of a wave, because now we see that finally everybody is supporting of what Ukraine finally did. And I wish we had that support 7 years ago when we just started that, because already at that point, you could definitely differentiate between what is a real media and what is just masquerading as a media and usurpating the premises of freedom of speech and other things, and basically usurpating democracy as a main tool to promote disinformation. And finally, we see the change of this attitude that yes, you can limit it, and it works very well. And this is not against democracy. This is not against freedom of speech, because for one very simple reason, it leaves more space for real freedom of speech. And also, as you know, Stulik is working as a third-party fact-checker for Facebook. And our activities on even labeling information over there as fake was very, very efficient, because people don't like to be labeled as carriers of disinformation. And also even media organizations. So I was absolutely knocked out of my socks when we received the letter from Russia Today, when they said, oh, you labeled our article as fake, so we corrected it for you, please remove the label, because we don't want to be considered as a disinformation outlet. So that was kind of a great output for us, because previously we can only say that, yes, there are a lot of disinformation around, but now finally we can take actions against that. And also another point also from our experience with working with Facebook was that some people were promoting some, for example, pro-Ukrainian misinformation. And they were also very upset when we've been labeling them that that's not true. And they've been saying, look at your description of Stulik, it's saying that you're against Russian disinformation. So why you are correcting us? Because we are pro-Ukrainian, it's a pro-Ukrainian disinformation. So it should be over there. So definitely we see that different people understand very definitely what is freedom of speech, how it's related to platforms, what should be the role of the government. But what is the most important, that finally we have this conversation taking all these components into account.
Thanks a lot. And before I invite Miss Mazurkiewicz, let me read questions from the broader audience. We have some from Mr. Andriy Medvedchuk from International Information Academy. So the two of them, I suppose, are specifically for Mr. Syczewski. The first one is, what action that Polish organization took helped in the war against spreading false information within the country and outside the country? And the second one, what countries, organizations were able to help with this problem, and how working with them helped, if there were any? And the third question, broader one, how is it possible for experts from Ukraine to cooperate with journalists from Poland on issues of disinformation? So if anybody has answers, of course, please, you are welcome to answer, but if not, of course, there is no obligation. And now I give the floor to Ms. Maia Mazurkiewicz. Ms. Mazurkiewicz is co-founder and head of intelligence at Alliance for Europe. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be in here, and I think that it's really important that we gather in the group of Ukrainian and Polish leaders or experts on the disinformation, and specifically to look at Ukraine as one of the first countries that have been attacked by the disinformation from Russia in a way as it is, as we all research it right now. And I think that it's really important to see the experience of experts from Ukraine and to look what we can do. Since with Alliance for Europe, we are dealing with fighting disinformation in a bit different structural way. We are looking at on disinformation in a way on how we can better spread information. So a bit of something that Yevhen Fedchenko has already said. Although I will not agree that disinformation and information, good information, good communication, it's something that is going into different target groups. If we are able to communicate rightly and use the good technological tools, we are able to fight disinformation in a way to target the public opinion. And I think what is the biggest issue that we don't really target it that much with the disinformation is how it changed the attitudes of people, right? We already discussed about what has happened in Ukraine regarding the attitudes of Ukrainians towards Poles. We also see the change of attitudes in Poland already by disinformation being widely spread by our government, also in the national media. And I believe that what is happening with disinformation was as well, like of the disinformation sector, so a bit touch upon, is the lack of resources, and especially lack of money for the organization fighting and dealing with disinformation. So we are all the time step behind. Russia and other big disinformation actors are spreading disinformation since years. We are researching it and discussing about it, and it's important and great. But we need to make sure that we are able to make a step forward and not be reactive, but be active and change the perception of people, go out with our information. What we are doing with the Alliance for Europe. We built social media intelligence unit, the monitoring system of the internet, what we are helping civil society organization and all the other actors that are willing to spread their communication in the social media better, to target specific target groups and communicate their visions, because the vision is super important in the communication, in the specific way, in the way that it's simple, in the way that is understandable by the target groups, and in the way that is also working on the emotions. So this information is working very well because it's always using the emotions. It's using mostly the fear and anger, sadness, all the bad emotions. We can use the good emotions, and we can also use specific designs that human mind is associating with something that they've seen before. So those are the things that are possible, and we just need to start to work on a different angle of disinformation. I was wondering if any of you had also a similar experience in doing that and tackling disinformation from the positive information sector. And I have a question as well to the panel. So as I said, like I love to look forward and look into the future. So really take the specific examples of what we can do as experts, as the community of the disinformation experts. So what we can do in order to finally be a step ahead, not step behind, specifically Russia and Ukraine, but all the other actors as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So please keep this important question in your minds. We will be back to it during the final round. And now it's time for Mr. David Stulik. Mr. Stulik is head of Eastern European program at European Values Center for Security Policy Prague, Czech Republic. Mr. Stulik.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you all for this occasion, just to meet you, if not in person, just in such an online format. And it's a great pleasure to be among the like-minded people, right? Because I wanted to share with you my latest, let's say, experience with even people who are part of my, let's say, liberal bubble. And that experience is related to that latest ban of Russian channels by pro-Russian channels by Mr. Zelensky, right? Because in that my bubble, even that it is pro-Ukrainian, it was perceived rather with mixed or rather with kind of negative feelings, because almost in the same time, there were similar developments, for example, in Hungary, where the last independent radio station was banned or was not prolonged the license. So the impression is that Ukraine has joined these groups of countries with rather authoritarian rulers, like with Hungary, right? And for me, it's absolutely, sometimes impossible to explain that Ukraine is still a democratic country. That for Ukraine, it's not just a matter of fighting with the journalists who express the other opinions, but it's a matter of national security, even though it's applied to Ukrainian channels, right? Because with the Russian channels, it still was more or less understandable even here. But with the Ukrainian channels, with pro-Russian owners, it's rather difficult. And that, again, brings me to the point that those who don't have the direct experience with the aggression of, in this case of Ukraine, of Russia, they won't be able to understand that there is a clear border between the freedom of speech and the concerns of national security. And again, this is an issue that is casting some shadow over the Ukraine's reputation abroad. You've seen the statements by the European Federation of Journalists and a few other professional international organizations that rather criticized the Zelensky's decision. So again, well, when I was working in Ukraine, I was always like trying to explain these things to journalists, foreign journalists. But here in the Czech Republic, even I'm just doing my best, it's rather impossible to convince the people, because they immediately point to such examples like Hungary, or sometimes even Poland. So this is what I wanted to share with you, that I don't have an answer and I don't have a solution how to bring that point of view of Ukraine to the Western audience. It's extremely difficult. And if you have any suggestions how to convince these people, as I said, who have pro-Ukrainian, liberal, pro-democratic views, I would be very grateful for your suggestions and advices. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So we have another two speakers in the third round of comments, so we can afford for the second round if anybody wants to add something because forget something. So I invite to join the discussion. After that, we will have this summing up session. So now it's time for Ms. Agnieszka Ostrowska. Ms. Ostrowska is a program director at the Center for International Relations in Warsaw. Please.
Yeah, I'm mute. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm really happy to see some familiar faces here. Our Center for International Relations executed some common projects with some think tanks from Ukraine, Yevhen, Stop Fake, and Jonas, Prague Security Studies Institute, devoted to this information. We've been trying to tackle this problem for quite a long time. That was the area of our interest, pro-Kremlin disinformation. And I have this feeling that our today's discussion was concentrated more about putting, like, I would say, equity mark between disinformation and pro-Kremlin malign or manipulative activities. And well, of course, this is something that we used to think about disinformation initially after the annexation of Crimea and Dignity Revolution in Ukraine, when the world kind of woke up and saw what Russia malign activities can actually do and how harmful they can be in the information space. But I would like to mention also that Russia and Federation is not the only source of disinformation, and we've got so many other sources right now, external sources, which is always easier. China, Iran, Turkey, and the biggest problem right now, and that's my question to you, how to tackle the problem that internal disinformation is probably the biggest challenge. According to, for instance, a report of Geremek Foundation, it was Polish politicians and Polish media who were the biggest source of disinformation about European Union during the first stages of pandemic. And my question is, since there is some coordinated response on this level of the European Union to external disinformation, maybe not adequate, because like East Stratcom, that kind of was created after all these problems we started to have with disinformation activity on the side of Russian Federation after 2014. It is created and it tries to tackle and debunk and deal with the problem on a more coordinated and structural level. And there are other Stratcoms as well, because the idea that the problem is so important is growing. And as I said, the number of actors is also getting bigger. Should we hope that at some point European Union will be able to respond with internal Stratcom, some action force, to tackle disinformation coming from the inside of the member state? Is it likely, is it realistic to think, since more and more European Union countries have the same problems, right? That the source of disinformation is not coming from the outside, but from the inside. Of course, I know that it is very difficult and maybe idealistic thing to think that such a thing could be achieved, but can we think at all of such a solution? That's my question, maybe first of all to Peter, but also to other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. And now it's time for Mr. Jonasz Syrowatka. Mr. Syrowatka is a program manager at Prague Security Studies Institute. Mr. Syrowatka, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. Well, I will kind of start off my commentary that will kind of turn into question later from actually the title of our very gathering, which is kind of skeletons in the closet. And I would actually argue that we have to also think about the skeletons which we are having in our closet, us as researchers, because as it was already pointed out, like this debate is ongoing already for 7 years. We are already 7 years trying to kind of think about the ways how to properly tackle this challenge of describe it, how to analyze it, and so on. And I am afraid that at the moment we are kind of already beyond the peak of kind of this kind of the golden era of disinformation research, and we will see in the future years like the sources of funding as well as interest of the policymakers and general public like diminishing. And therefore I think like us as a researchers, we have to kind of think harder about things that are working, not working, about approaches that are relevant, not relevant, and so on. And I would try to do this quick exercise here in those like in following three minutes or so by pointing out like three areas, which I think are kind of crucial perspectives on the things we are researching, and to think about the ways how we are kind of how we approach them. And those areas are kind of framed in the three basic questions. It's just kind of like what, how, and why. And I think that we are pretty good in analyzing of what, like, you know, we are able to kind of track, say, what are the narratives, what are the messages, and to describe them and to kind of catch them in the information space. We are also more and more capable in this kind of how areas, or how the information is kind of spreading in the environment. But the thing I think is we are kind of still lacking is the proper answers to this why question, like why certain audiences, why certain people are more keen to listen to those messages, why they prefer them instead of factually correct information, why they, you know, what's the reason why they are listening to these dubious sources and dubious narratives. And that would be actually my questions to the distinguished panelists, like whether they have like some good and, if possible, specific examples of what kind of researches that are going into this this area and help us to answer and understand these questions. However, I will take my chance and to kind of try to give my own answer. And my own answer is actually how to get better understanding is to try to enlarge the discussion, because from my point of view, currently it seems to me that like the debate about disinformation is very much limited in a way of kind of people who are involved in it. Like it's very much limited to the journalists, it's very much limited to the security and policy experts. But honestly, some of the most interesting contributions, which I recently encountered, were presented by completely different people, were presented by sociologists, they presented by people who are kind of experts on religion, and they try to kind of explain how the conspiracy theories are kind of becoming religion and so on. So that would be definitely something I would kind of very much plead for, to open this topic way more and to invite some other experts into the debate, because by that we can kind of enlarge our horizon. Thank you for the attention. I'm looking forward for the further conversation.
Thanks a lot. And the first round will be completed with the intervention by Ms. Raimonda Miglinaite. Ms. Miglinaite is a member of the East Stratcom Task Force in Brussels. Ms. Miglinaite, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And it is really a pleasure to be here. And since both the East Stratcom Task Force and the European Democracy Action Plan were mentioned, I feel that I would like to say a few things. And these are two main points. So coming back to Ms. Ostrovska's also question about sort of dealing with disinformation in the European Union, I think we're all quite aware about, you know, sometimes it's not so easy to say what's, so to speak, internal and what's external. That's also, I think, a part of the challenge. But if you look at the European Democracy Action Plan and the way it's framed, it speaks precisely about that. How do we strengthen, reinvigorate, and protect the European democracy? So which includes questions about, you know, protection of free and fair elections. How do we strengthen freedom of media and pluralism? And also, how do we deal with disinformation? So it sort of reflects this comprehensive approach, or at least strives to one. And I think this is very important when we deal with well, disinformation threats within the European Union. And of course, then there's an external element. And here I would like to sort of circle back at the very beginning of discussion, where a question about definitions were raised. I mean, what do we understand when we talk about disinformation? So if you look exactly at the document text itself, at the European Democracy Action Plan, and I know there's been quite a bit of a reflection. So what is it that we're talking about when we're talking about a threat of disinformation? And so the document actually spells 4 different well, types, I would say, or offers 4 different definitions that could guide the conversation. And of course, one is the most simple, you know, what we understand by misinformation. So in an unintentionally wrong information. And we've seen that a lot during the COVID pandemic, right? So messages spreading on WhatsApp from helpful relatives about, you know, some kind of herbal remedies against the virus. So without really intent to mislead. disinformation, and it has been defined in some EU documents before, for example, in 2018 action plan. It talks about verifiably false information that is spread with intent to mislead and cause public harm. So there's this intent element. But of course, everything gets more complicated with that. And it was already mentioned here that, for example, sometimes factual information can also be used for to undermine the democratic debate. And here we talk about influence operations, which can, also suppress information and sort of try to influence the opinions of the audiences. And finally, foreign interference, which talks more about manipulation of information itself. And here the hybrid elements come in, for example, cyber attacks. So there's a quite a comprehensive look at it. And one of the things that the European Democracy Action Plan strives to do is to develop sort of a common framework and understanding to collect systematic evidence about foreign interference, for example. And that also means to have a dialogue with civil society and with private industry to really pull all these strands together to have a comprehensive response. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we can open the second round of our comments. And Mr. Volodymyr Yermolenko wanted to join discussion. So please, the floor is yours. And if anybody would like to add something before we go to sum up session, so please give a sign. Mr. Yermolenko.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to reflect upon a little bit of what David said and maybe what Jonas also said. On David's question about the ban of these pro-Russian TV channels linked to Mr. Medvedchuk, I think we should not expect, that the question is easy. It's really a very difficult question. The point is that the debate is opened up a little bit in a different way, I think, right now. And Zhenya Fedchenko mentioned this already, that, for example, we were quite surprised, for example, how American embassy at the same day reacted to it, saying we meet it with understanding, etc. So I think personally that the debate is changed right now is precisely after the ban of Twitter account by Mr. Trump, which Jerzy Pomianowski I think mentioned, because it for the Western society it showed a dilemma between freedom and security, with which we're facing in Ukraine since at least 2014. And this also, I'm referring to what Zhenya Fedchenko said about, this tolerance dilemma. It's the same with freedom dilemma. So it's a very difficult debate. It's just, it's a very difficult debate. I can theoretically say, we should find a balance between security and freedom. Why? Because if democracies do not protect themselves, there will be no freedom. If democracies do not protect their sovereignty, there will be no freedom of speech, no human rights, etc. But the question where to find this balance is a very difficult one. Now, if we talk about, Medvedchuk TV channels, we're talking basically not even about what they're saying, but where they get the money. So it's principle follow the money. And if you have an actor which is financed by a state which is aggressing you militarily, of course, the debate is kind of framed in a different way, I think. And it's not about the question about banning the journalists, about banning the media. Let me just come back to this idea of malinformation. I think the key, in disinformation, the key intention is to say that these facts you believe in don't exist. And why I'm talking about it as just a peak of an iceberg, because the aim of these influence operations and malinformation is to say that you don't exist. And it's the same in Ukraine, in Europe, in United States, everywhere. The narrative is that Ukraine is a failed state. Well, it's the same narrative about Europe, because Russians are saying that Europe does not exist. Or after the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States, they were saying, or attack on Capitol Hill, they were saying that America does not exist. So it's a much deeper thing that just, you know, a debate about facts. Of course, they're very, very, very important. And let me also reflect upon what Jonas said. I think this is a very important remark. We need to enlarge the discussion. And the question of why is very important. Because we, right now with Peter, we're making a project of understanding why people believe in this anti-reformist, anti-Western campaign, which was spread by Medvedchuk TV channels. And one of the preliminary conclusions is that the area of, so the people who internalize some of these narratives like external governance goes far beyond the bubble of Medvedchuk TV channels. That means that there is something inside, for example, Ukrainian society in this particular case, that forces people to believe it. Why people are going, becoming trolls online. There is a great book, The Dark Net by Jamie Bartlett, who is saying that, look, at the beginning of the internet, it was in the 80s, it was full of people which were basically, thanks to their anonymous behavior, which were just crazy, mad, and cruel online. So there is something in people's psychology that makes people be cruel online. So I think we should understand it as well with the help of sociologists, psychologists, philosophers, etc. It's not only about, you know, tackling absurdist messages or some conspiracy theories. It's much more deep. Thank you.
Thank you. This is the last chance to add something, if anybody wants, before summing up. So, if not, so I'd like to open the final session, but in the opposite order than we started. So, if I can ask Ms. Tsekhanovska to begin and to share her thoughts after the conversation.
Well, I think we've touched upon a number of very significant issues that involve a lot of parties, both within societies and on the multinational level even. And it poses us with a necessity to develop a very complex and sophisticated response system, the response system that needs to be proactive on a societal level. And because it is my firm belief that unless we stop simply defending ourselves and actually take a proactive stance, nothing will really change. Because disinformation as a part of malign hybrid influence is here to stay. We have to operate with keeping that thought in mind. So for us, I think it is crucial, of course it is an oversimplification, but we don't have that much time. For us, it is crucial to do two things, I think. It is absolutely necessary to increase national resilience of each target society. And increasing national resilience is a process that goes both upside down and from the grassroots level to the upper governmental level as well. So this is a complex system that in states, especially I think in states that are territorially rather big, like Ukraine, this process needs to be diversified, because we know very well that when we deal with Kremlin's hybrid influence, it involves different vulnerabilities. This is the thing that I've talked already about. It exploits different weaknesses even in the same society, and we have to be ready for that. We have to keep that in mind. But we also have to understand that this is the same tactic that it is applied not only on the level of region, on the level of a nation, but also on the level of bilateral and multilateral relations. And these tactics, of course, are very similar. But I think that if we actively involve each other, if we keep each other engaged, and it is very important on both on the level of our governments and on the level of our civic societies, it makes us stronger. It gives us an opportunity to take precisely that proactive stance that we need so much. I think we had a very productive discussion today that touched upon a number of topics which are all very crucial and important. So it is kind of hard to make a specific conclusion for a discussion as broad and as important for that. I think I'll stop with that.
Thanks a lot. And now Mr. Olgart Suchevsky.
Thank you. Maybe I agree that it's very hard to sum up such a discussion with so much different angles that we touched up with. But I would like also to maybe answer some questions because they were pretty important and I think they are worth mentioning and following up. So firstly, Mrs. Agnieszka Legucka asked if disinformation has also this cyber component. Is it very important? And in my opinion, the networks in the internet, they are one of the most important components of disseminating disinformation, meaning that one fake news, one fact cannot be exploited, cannot be working as a narrative until it isn't spread within the network, right? It needs to have some proper outreach to have the effect. So this is like a crucial component for modern disinformation because we know that information is treated as a weapon from some time, right? We know Goebbels, we know Stalinism, they were also treating information as a weapon. But right now in the modern world, the technology is helping also to spread this kind of narratives. And there was also a question to me, was there any response on political and let's say organizational level to the disinformation fight, like which was targeting Polish and Ukrainian relations. So, and this is pretty important aspect I want to underline. Back then, in the time we analyzed those campaigns, both governments, so Polish government and Ukrainian government, they were basically giving some presents to Kremlin because of their internal interests to gain more electorate or to gain stronger army on the eastern Ukraine or to have a dispute on project of IPN law in Poland. It was all focused on internal cases and internal relations, but it was a very big present to Kremlin just to exploit that and fuel that and play with that, right? To fuel the tensions. So unfortunately, back then there was nothing which was done on political level. But we must also say that the narratives are changed. We can clearly see an example of I think it was last year when President Andrzej Duda was being pranked by Russian YouTubers, and they called him, they were pretending, right, that they're not Russian YouTubers. And they even asked President Duda what he thinks about Lviv, if Lviv is a Polish, what he thinks about that case. And he clearly stated that this is a Ukrainian city, there is no such political dispute around Lviv. So this was a clear also message, at least back then, later on, that there are no political conflicts over that case. So there are some small actions, but for sure, in my personal opinion, I miss some strategic, proactive communication that will be faster and that can predict some kind of actions that will go to Poland from external countries. So proactive is very, very important. And following up to Mrs. Mazurkiewicz point, I think that what we can do to be proactive and to be better, we need to really focus on technology, on inventions that can help us, experts working on disinformation efforts. And I really want to underline that behavioral science, I think this is also very important part of knowledge that should be also taken to the consideration, because behavioral science could help us understand the drivers. So exactly why each person, such target groups, are vulnerable or are easier to inject with concrete narratives. This is the part that would help us to then create effective counter messaging. And this is very important, that we need also to have some tools, capabilities to counter message and to convince the concrete groups that their target, for example, Kremlin's disinformation, but also different countries are also doing disinformations. And I think that's it. And I think that our discussion is the best example that disinformation topic is so broad that we should have at least 7 more panels on each topic to dive really into the topic. But again, thank you for inviting me.
Thanks a lot. And now I'd like to ask Mr. Pomianowski to share his thoughts.
Thanks a lot. Extremely interesting discussion and very much enjoy. As you know, Endowment is not a think tank. So whenever we talk and take part in these discussions, although making some aggregated messages, we actually rely on experience that is provided to us by many of our grantees. Some of them are sitting among participants or previous in a kind of previous years. But here I want again to join this discussion with the kind of more broader a few reflections that are extremely interesting to me, and that I'm inspired by this discussion. First, about definition of disinfo. Definitely, I personally would stick to this intentional action. Intentional action is a core that is behind it, and that's why we have a right and we have obligation to fight and to strategize in this fight. And this intention includes to harm, to deceive, to confuse, to block, to distract, to replace, to alternate. You remember that the concept of alternate facts created by the former Trump press AD. So, and it is important what Peter also was saying that in his books that in this propaganda or in this deliberate messaging, there is no ideology, there is no even message. And they are intended to harm, they are simply exploring what can get through. So when they talk about Kiev, they would say you are nationalist, fascist. When they go to Paris or Rome, they will say you are not enough nationalists. You have to be more nationalist. If you go to London, they would say you have to be more sovereign. So there is no any consistency. The only one reason is to harm, to add kind of negative emotions to blur space. So in that sense, this is important to keep in mind in reacting or in analyzing. Second, I would say the question what we can do to be ahead, not behind those actions. I think we have to dismantle also the systems that are working toward this type of actions. So we have to push them out of their zone of comfort and then let us simply redefine a battlefield. If we are looking, for example, into info space of Russia, how it was for so many years dominated by only one narrative, one type of media, and a mechanism that were driving this space were not helping us. That's why we're reactive, because the battlefield was our territory. They were entering our info space. We were not active enough there, but we don't need to be active there by counter messaging or stratcom activities. We need to be active there, simply supporting those who are providing trustful and truthful information and who are opposing this type of toxic narratives. And if we look into results of recent Navalny video, 90 million of spectators, of audience, that shows that there is a way also to message to those societies in the right way, with the right message, right information, that is not counter propaganda, that it's simply disclosing important facts and truths about their own life and political context. So in this respect, to support those type of trustful media, to support all attempts to create international support for public interest media, different type of funding mechanisms, it's important, but also to create those labeling mechanisms that are self-regulatory mechanisms based on code of ethics, based on reputed important personalities and a group of networks that can be, in a sense, empowered to make those labeling, both what is negative and what is positive. As stop fakes labels not true or fake information, we can also label trustful sources. So in that sense, this is a huge task for international associations of journalists and so on and so on. And in this context, let me finish with the comment on freedom of expression and the recent decision of the Ukrainian government. As I was critical about establishing of the Ministry of Information a long time ago, that actually ended its life in 2019. But for this decision, I am quite supportive, although I have to say that this decision is like, you know, a cry of doing something where everything else failed. The judiciary system failed because such a personality like Medvedchuk could be brought to justice through the normal follow the money procedures, the prosecution, the investigators, and other mechanisms that strong state should have in their hand in order to address direct threats to its security. That is something that is definitely happened, and that is it was not addressed on time. And finally, a failure of anti-oligarchization policies and strategic objective of Ukraine itself. And that is definitely also one of those failures that eventually leads the government to take such a dramatic decision, like simply closing channels. And finally, here within this decision, I will make a small distinction. For example, when I'm supportive of closing those channels, I'm not that supportive of, for example, ceasing access to Vkontakte. This is a battlefield, and you have millions Ukrainians who can join that platform and in perfect Russian, with understanding every nuance of the communication, post their own view and then fight back within the same platform effectively. So simply by putting a firewall here, maybe is a not smartest solution, but the closing Medvedchuk channels, I think, was right decision.
Thanks a lot. And now Mr. Pomerantsev.
Yes, what a fascinating discussion, and so many brilliant questions. I actually feel that we're not going round in circles. I feel there's been huge developments over 7 years in the space of understanding communications, disinformation. I think that this will be one of the big issues for the Summit of Democracies. I think most importantly, within America, there is now an understanding that we really need to have a look at our fundamental kind of our fundamental approaches to the information environment and what is a democratic information environment. So I think there's huge advances, and I think just the way that sort of like the latest iteration of the Democracy Action Plan and the Digital Service Act has taken on these issues and has set out some guidelines to discuss them, at least, is already a huge step forward. Where we have been going round in circles is what to do about Russia. There has been no strategy. there is still just like flapping about and trying to make lots of contradictory actions, as Mr. Borrell's recent trip takes. So let's separate these two issues. There's a Russia issue, which we have no progress on. And we have an information issue where there is, at least at the elite level, among policymakers, among academics, among researchers, and among funders, an understanding of this is a structural issue. And now we're talking about, structural reforms to social media companies. Look, I don't know who's been paying attention to My Little Island. I know we're now in irrelevance, but if you noticed, Ofcom the British regulator just banned CGTN. And if you look carefully why, and look, we still have to go through this, you have to go through the small print, but part of the reason they're saying is because you cannot guarantee that CGTN is editorially independent from the state. So they seem to be opening up a framework saying you are only a media if you're editorially independent. Now, where that goes later, I'm fascinated. Obviously, we can think of other states, but what about oligarchic influences? If you are not independent of your owners, are you a media? They seem to be opening up a very interesting legal discussion, which I don't think we've really understood yet. This happened like 24 hours ago, but that's very, very interesting. But look, there's this key question about definitions, which hangs over everything we do. We're all throwing words around because we're using, we're using symbols and metonymies and metaphors, and we use terms like fake news and disinformation loosely. And I think a couple of people said, okay, let's define this in a strict legal way. Look, when it comes to disinformation, when we're talking about the offline space, broadcasting and all these things, the tradition is there already. This is not new. Some countries like America choose not to have any regulation, and they need to question whether that works. But in Europe, and certainly in Britain, there is a very clear tradition about regulating broadcasting in line with impartiality and accuracy. And David, to your question, of course, the issue in Ukraine is not that Medvedchuk channels has been banned, but why now? Because if you had a normal regulator, it would have happened a long time ago. If you had normal courts, it would have happened a long time ago. If you had a normal national security strategy, it would have happened a long time ago. Yeah, and the question is now, and many of us are relieved that it's happened, but actually I'm 80% in favor. 20% of me is going, hold on, did they just do this because of elections? And if it is just because of elections, who's next? Okay, so I have a very big 20% caveat there around this decision, though 80% of me is in favor. So we're talking about disinformation online in the digital space. I spent 2 years in a Euro-American kind of discussion group trying to define online disinformation. And you had everyone there from Thomas Ilves, who's obviously a bit of a hawk, through to Jeff Jarvis, who's this professor at NYU, who's a famous libertarian of speech, who says any kind of control over content is the straight path to dictatorship. But we found agreement. After 2 years of shouting at each other and calling each other morons, we actually found some agreement. And it was about really shifting, actually, the idea of disinformation away from content, which is almost impossible to define, to behavior, amplification, and actors. We're talking about online, we're talking about deceptive behavior. The sort of thing we've been talking here a lot. Inauthentic accounts, amplification. I would go further than that. I think the way that we do not understand how algorithms order things, how search engine optimization is gained, the fact this is all in the dark is all types of deception. We live in a world of structural disinformation. So not the one tweet is the problem, it's the troll farm creating 1,000 tweets, which is the problem. We can regulate against that. The actors behind it, if there's not transparency around who is behind these things, then you're talking about deceptive actors, and you can take action on that. So once we shifted our idea of disinformation onto behavior, systems, design, amplification, targeting, why are you seeing a piece of information? Who is behind it? How much did they spend? Why is it being targeted to you? Which of your data is being used? All of that at the moment is unrevealed. So once you get it into that place, suddenly an Estonian hawkish statesman and an American libertarian could agree. That is something that should be illegal. So there is ways forward that we can find. I'll sign off with one last sort of question, though. I do think we need to find a liberal democratic idea of security in this space. I don't think we can start using the terms information sovereignty. That's a term that's completely already exploited and abused by China and Russia. We do have to find a legal way of defining information aggression as opposed to the free flow of information across borders. And we do have to find some way of securitizing openness, but without using the logic of the dictatorships. I do think it's one that has to be based in rights and human rights. I do suspect it will be around things like transparency and openness. And how do you make transparency and openness parts of the logic of security? But look, I can't pretend to solve that right now. But I do think that is something that that's kind of an intellectual barrier that we have to break.
Thanks a lot. Before I pass the microphone to Oleksandra to close the conference, let me share some final remarks. I don't dare to sum up this conference because, as you proved, that the topic is much more complex than I expected. So just really few comments. First of all, you have proved that the issue is very complex, but you have also shown that we have tools and intellectual capacities to deal with the problem. So it's very important. Then you showed that we need cooperation, but you have also shown many examples that cooperation is going on between different agencies and organizations. So it's also a good sign when we talk about the answers to the problem of disinformation. The bigger problem is, of course, the issue of political will and political cooperation in the field of state agencies and on the level of political agency. And the final problem, which is directly addressed to us in planning further conferences, is the issue of broadening the pool of experts. That it's not enough to talk within inner, I would say, circle of experts dealing directly with disinformation. We need to extend this field to other specialists like sociologists and so on. So thanks for this suggestion. We will follow it, and the next meetings will be hopefully with them. So thanks a lot for really fascinating discussion. It was a real privilege to moderate such an interesting conversation, and have a good day. And now I'd like to ask Oleksandra to say his words and then to close the conference. Oleksandra?
Thank you. Thank you, Edwin. And yes, it's really a great pleasure to be here and to listen to all of you. So this was a really fruitful debate, and it disclosed how much the world has been changed since that when some decades ago we started working in particular for media freedoms, for the freedom of speech. Each of us was growing in totally different environment, in which we have some very simple picture where there was a government which was trying to some way limit freedom of speech, freedom of press, and on the other hand was a democratic society which was eager to overcome the restrictions. Now we are in a totally different world, and I like to express my gratitude to Peter, to Jerzy, to Alexandra, to all others who are very, so that narrative which we shared today disclose how much difficult this world is about, and it's really not an easy for us, not just to react on the challenges, but also to offer some democratic reaction to the challenges which we see. And sometimes it's really not easy to define what is appropriate, what is good, what is not. How can we limit that forces which use variety of instruments to misguide people, to brainwash, to I would say to derail people from the normal way of thinking. So really this is probably the most complicated challenges of the current world. And the way how we find finally the way to tackle and to deal with this problem is one of the key responses on how can we defend democracy and freedoms. And so that is why we put so extraordinary attention to the issues of the fighting against disinformation, fakes, and all these instruments which we observe now in the world, which provided existential threat for democratic world and for Ukraine in particular. We feel it on daily basis, how it works. So thank you so much, Edwin and Batory Foundation and all the partners, all the experts who joined today to this event, to Ukrainian Prism as a co-organizer of this event. And I hope that I hope you also share my perception that that was good time, 2 hours we spent for good. And I wish you a good day, good season, and I hope we overcome. Thank you.